Good evening. Welcome to St. Angela Merici and our continuing Lenten series. Our speaker tonight is Orianne Dyck. She's with the Daughters of St. Paul as a postulant. She was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, and grew up in Ontario. She is the oldest child in a multicultural family with 2 younger brothers. She earned a degree in anthropology and international development and a degree in education. She taught for 5 years before deciding to leave it all behind to discern more deeply a call to the religious life. Orianne is now a postulant with the Daughters of St. Paul here in St. Louis. She will talk with us tonight about her journey to Catholicism. After her talk, she would welcome questions about her faith journey and her vocational discernment. Orianne?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Teresa, for your introduction and for putting the stool here for me. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate your attentiveness and your interest. And you will notice throughout the course of this that I do have an accent. I am from Canada. And maybe just before we get started, if we could take a moment to bow our heads together and to say a quick prayer, thanking the Lord for bringing us together this night. Loving Father, thank you for the stories of each and every one of us, for your patient and your creative work in our lives, and your transformative work in our hearts. Throughout the course of this night, please help us to reflect on the work of your hand in our own lives and in the lives of those around us. And please help us have a safe and a fruitful time together here where all of our stories intersect this night. We ask this in the name of Jesus, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Thank you. So as you have heard, I was indeed born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and I am the oldest of 3 kids. I have 2 younger brothers, and we're pretty tight. And I was born into a very multicultural family. And so I'm going to put you on the spot for a second, and please don't feel shy to either shout out an answer if I ask you a question or put up your hand. I did used to be a teacher, so I can wait it out if no one answers. On my father's side, my family is primarily Mennonite. So when you hear the word Mennonite, what comes to your mind? What do you think of when you hear Mennonite? Yeah, good. Amish, horse and buggies, yeah. So fun fact, there's actually 200 or more different kinds of Mennonite. And so my family, you couldn't necessarily pick out on the street. They dressed the same as everyone else. They went to the same schools. They spoke the same way. The thing that really unites the Mennonite people is a belief in adult baptism. They don't believe in infant baptism, and a belief in pacifism. And so that was really my dad's side of the family that definitely had an influence on us growing up. And then on my mom's side of the family, my family is Lebanese through and through. And so when you hear Lebanon, or if you're not familiar with Lebanon per se, when you hear the Middle East, what faith traditions might come to mind? Yeah, good. Muslims. Any others? Yeah, Christians, for sure. I know that we have a Mennonite church. We have a Lebanese Maronite church here in St. Louis. Any others? I can hear voices, but I can't hear what you're saying. Yeah, thank you. Judaism. So my family actually belongs to none of those major religions in the Middle East. My family belongs to a religious minority called the Druze tradition, D-R-U-Z-E. And the Druze people were an offshoot of Islam. So there's a very heavy Islamic and Quranic influence in the Druze faith. And so the Druze presence in my life was definitely a very heavy influence in how I perceived and learned about God from my mom's side of the family. When my parents first met each other, because of where life had taken them, they were both attending the United Church of Canada, which is a Protestant denomination. It's the most popular, actually, I think, one in Canada. And so they were married there, and we were baptized there. And that's where I first started learning about who God was and who Jesus was. And I loved my United Church. I loved it a lot. They were so friendly, they were so welcoming, very community-oriented, and there was a real joy in that community. And I loved going to Sunday school and hearing stories about all the things that Jesus did throughout his life and in our lives. And one of the things I really liked happened about once a month when the children were sitting up in the pews with the adults, and there would be a round silver tray that would get passed up and down all of the pews. And in the middle of this silver tray was like these little fluffy cubes of bread, and around the outside of the tray were these teeny glasses full of Welch's grape juice, which happened to be my favorite kind of juice as a child, and still is, actually. And it was a real treat for us, not only because it was something very communal we were all partaking in, and it was something commemorative for us as well. We were remembering Jesus' supper with his disciples. But it was also kind of a treat, especially because my mom never bought us juice. She was convinced that it was bad for you. And so this was like the one time a month we got juice. And that was really our understanding at that time of what communion was. It was definitely not seen as a sacrament in the way that we understand it as Catholics. At the same time, my parents bought our first children's Bible. It was a Protestant children's Bible, but it was quite thick and pretty extensive. And I devoured it as a child. And it was really in those pages that I started to fall in love with God, that I encountered this person who was unlike any other person that I had ever known, who was so great and so beyond anything that I could understand and so powerful, but at the same time, someone who was so tender and so loving and someone who was friend. And so I started to develop this real desire to get to know him better for who he was, not for how I wanted to construct him in my own mind, but for who he was as himself. I really wanted to get to know him and to love him better. And I had this desire to serve him. I wanted to do something for this God that I was beginning to see had done so much for me. And it was about that time in my life that my dad's work got transferred from the province of Manitoba to the province of Ontario. And so we moved, and we left our entire family behind us, and our church. It was very difficult for my whole family. And when we moved, there were some things happening in the 90s in the United Church that my mom was beginning to notice weren't necessarily biblical. And so when we moved to Ontario, to this teeny town that we moved to, she didn't feel confident anymore that she could walk into a United Church and automatically just trust that it would be biblically founded in all of the values that it was like helping us to build. And so my mom went on a quest to find a more Bible-based church. And she remembered from her childhood that once one of her friends had invited her to a Catholic Mass. We thought it was called a service at the time. We didn't realize it was called a Mass. And she was struck by two things that she still carried as a memory in her 20s and 30s when I was a child, that there was a very tangible sense of reverence in the Catholic Church and how much of the Bible they had read at Mass. And it was because of her understanding that, okay, they value the Bible, they read a lot of the Bible, and they revere the Bible, they really hold it as something sacred, that she decided that we were going to try out the Catholic Church. We didn't realize that you had to do anything to become Catholic. We just kind of walked into church one day and started going, and no one asked us any questions, so we didn't realize that we weren't supposed to just do that. And so we walked into church, we started attending. My mom was receiving communion because we didn't know we weren't supposed to. And at the same time, we realized that in the province of Ontario, Catholic education is publicly funded, so it was free. And in Manitoba, my parents could not afford to send all three of us kids to Catholic school, but in Ontario they could. And both of my parents had a very strong sense of wanting us to receive Christian values in school and to have people who could help us in our faith and life journey. And so they decided to send us to Catholic school. And that was really where I started encountering just this whole other world that I wasn't aware of before. And I was starting to be taught things that challenged what I had learned before and also what I was learning at home. Because despite the fact that we were now attending Catholic Church, we were still very Protestant at home. because we didn't know any different and because that was how we were raised. And we also did have at home a very tangible Druze and Quranic influence in our life and how we understood things. And so that didn't go away when I was in Catholic school as a child. And so as a member of our class in Catholic school, we prepared for the sacraments. And so I received the sacrament of reconciliation with my class, with everybody else, in preparation for the sacrament of communion. And because we had had communion at my old church and I had partook in it, I didn't really understand why I had to go through all of this in order to share communion in the Catholic Church. But I did realize that there was something very different about communion in the Catholic Church, not only because I wasn't allowed to receive it anymore, but because of the way it was structured and this deep sense of reverence and seriousness that surrounded people going up to take the host. And in my class, as we were preparing for communion, our teacher told us that communion was the real body and blood of Jesus Christ. And I know that there are probably a lot of children who don't fully understand that, but I consciously rejected that idea. When she said that, my first thought was, okay, if that's true, that's cannibalism, and God's not okay with cannibalism, so that can't be right. But what I did pick up from that was that Jesus was somehow present in some way in the host. And that explained so much of the reverence that we were picking up on in the Catholic Church. And it was a reverence that was very ingrained in me, not only because I was noticing like the greatness and the mystery of God in my children's Bible, but also because of that Quranic influence in my life. It's very, very tangible in the Quran how great God is, how beyond everything we can understand God is, and how mysterious God is. And so with that understanding, it actually helped me, ironically, peg this reality that was in the Catholic Church, that God was here, yes, as friend, and yes, as something familiar, and yes, as someone joyful, as someone that we rejoice in and have community with, but also in his greatness, also in his mystery, also in that depth that we can't fathom, that he was here fully in a way that he hadn't been present in my United Church before. And I was beginning to understand that that was in large part because he was present in a way that he hadn't been present in my United Church in the host, that he was here in a different way. I didn't believe at the time that it was really the body and really the blood, but that he was present somehow in a way that he wasn't before. And so I took communion with this somewhat understanding of what communion was with my class, and was holding that as something sacred in my life. Very soon after that, my parents actually transferred me from Catholic school to public school because the public school in our town started offering an extended French program. And in Canada, French is the other official language of our country, and my parents thought it was very important that we would grow up to know both of our languages. And so I left Catholic school. When I was in grade 6, my former classmates at Catholic school were all going together as a class to receive the sacrament of confirmation. And I was offered a choice by my parents if I would like to receive confirmation with my classmates or if I wanted to continue on my merry way, the way that I was. And I took that decision very seriously. Because although I know that, theologically speaking, the moment of confirmation is not the moment that we necessarily decide to confirm the faith as our own. It's when the Spirit gives us a deeper share in the gifts to help build up the kingdom. But for me at that time, it was very much a decision of whether or not I wanted to be Catholic. We were still very Protestant at home. There were so many things that I did not feel comfortable with within the Catholic Church. And I recognized that at this moment in this decision, I would be choosing whether or not to take a sacrament that really almost no other church that I knew of taught as a sacrament, that I would really be acknowledging this teaching of the Catholic Church and the Catholic Church alone as something correct, that I would be like backing the Catholic Church and throwing my lot in with the Catholic Church. And so I was a very thoughtful child, and I went on these really long philosophical walks by myself up and down the streets of our town, wrestling with myself over this question because it really bothered me. It was a very difficult decision for me. And I could think of 50 different reasons that I should not become Catholic. I could think of 50 different things I didn't like about the Catholic Church. I could think of 50 different things that from my perspective at the time were wrong or unbiblical about the Catholic Church. I really didn't like at the time that I could look around and only see men who were priests. I didn't understand why women could not be priests. And it almost felt to me that women didn't have a place in the clergy. And I saw a lot of women in statues around me, and I saw people kneeling in front of the statues, and I had this alert going off in my Protestant mind saying, what is happening? This isn't right. Our prayer should be to Jesus. And something that really bothered me was how Mary was treated in the church. It seemed to me at the time that we almost revered and prayed to Mary to the point that we were nudging Jesus aside. And I had this frustrated call of my heart saying, like, no, we can't do this. This has to be about Jesus. This has to be about Jesus. And it was that same frustrated yearning of my heart that led me to the one reason I could think of that I should become Catholic. It was just one reason, that this had to be about Jesus. And I knew with all of the other problems that I had with the Catholic Church, I knew that Jesus was present here in a way that he had not been in my old church. And even from going to my friends' churches, I knew that he was present here in a way that he was not present anywhere else. And that's not to say he wasn't present in any of those churches. Of course he was. But there was something extra here. There was something more full. There was something whole. And I wanted all of Jesus. I didn't want part of him. I wanted all of him. And so I did choose to be confirmed. And so when people ask me when I converted, I will often point back to my confirmation just because it's a visible moment where I made a decision. But in reality, I was confirmed, and thank the Lord, I was given all of these graces of confirmation. He knew I needed them desperately. But I came out of confirmation, yes, with this deep love of Jesus Christ. But at the same time, I didn't change in a lot of my other attitudes towards the Catholic Church. I had a lot of problems, and I didn't even feel comfortable sometimes saying to other people that I was Catholic. But God had drawn me in, and he knew that I was hanging on. He knew that I wouldn't leave because I had made a decision of where I found him and where he was. And so it was just a few years later, one of my Muslim friends in public school told me that she was going to get bused out of our little town to go to a Catholic high school an hour's ride away. There was no Catholic high school in our town. There just weren't enough people. And she knew I was Catholic, and she asked if I wanted to go with her. And that was a very difficult decision for me. I was a very shy child, despite being a very passionate one. And just the idea of leaving everyone behind that I knew and going and starting fresh in another school really scared me. But the idea of learning about God in school really excited me, and I thought that was so amazing that I could learn about Jesus in school now with someone who had a deeper understanding now that I was older. And so I agreed, and I asked my parents, because of course I needed their permission, and they said, okay, we'll try it out, and if you don't like it, then we just won't send your brothers there. And so they let me go to Catholic school, and it was at that Catholic high school that I met some people. I made some very dear friends who have still kept in touch even now that I'm living here in the States, who really challenged my perception of a lot of Catholic teachings. They themselves were very Catholic. One of them had an uncle who was a priest. And they weren't afraid of my questions. They never felt that I was attacking them if I had an honest question. And they weren't afraid to try and answer. And if they could tell that their answer was really not at all satisfactory to me, or if they didn't know the answer, they weren't afraid to ask with me. They would go and find the answer for me because they knew where to look, and I did not. I didn't have anyone in my life that I could ask. I didn't know that catechisms existed. I didn't know that the Catholic Bible had more books than the Protestant Bible, and I still had a Protestant Bible at home, although I was reading it voraciously. But they knew. And they shared that with me. And they were able to answer a lot of my questions, not all of them, but they started to show me that there was a logic behind the teachings of Catholicism that I didn't agree with. They started to show me that this wasn't just out of nowhere that these things came about, that there was a reason for them. I had a couple teachers too who really made a huge difference in my life in a similar way. And one of our teachers in particular, he helped us in the pro-life group that I joined. And he taught me, my friends already knew, he taught me how to pray the rosary. I didn't feel comfortable praying the rosary. I felt like I was somehow doing something wrong. But I did pray it with them, and I was beginning to see that in their lives at least, this was something powerful. This was something real to them, and this was something that in some way was actually drawing them closer to Christ. And it was that understanding that really would help me understand Mary later on in my life, even if I wasn't making that connection for myself right away. And they were very patient with me. They never expected me to get it right away or this year or next year. They were very, very patient with me. And so once I graduated from high school, I was no longer ashamed to say that I was Catholic, although I still had a lot of problems, and some of them were the same that I brought into confirmation, and a lot of misunderstandings, but I was getting a little closer. And I went off to university, just to a regular secular university, a wonderful educational facility. And I went and I found a church, and I would go about once a month. I didn't feel the need to go every week. I didn't actually know we had an every week obligation because no one had ever told me that growing up. I knew that people went every week, but I decided I would sleep in all the other weeks and just go once a month to receive the Eucharist and to attend Mass. And one of my housemates was also Catholic, so we would both go once a month together. I would drive. And I felt pretty good in my relationship with God. I had a really deep prayer life, and God met me so abundantly there. But then something happened. My parents got divorced. And I knew that they had a bit of a tenuous relationship, but I never thought that they would get divorced. And it almost felt like everything that I knew became a lie. Everything that I had based my understanding on unconditional love on fell apart. And a lot of things came out during the divorce that hurt me very deeply. And I became filled with this bitterness and this anger and this shame and unforgiveness. And I still loved my parents very deeply, and I knew that I should forgive them. I knew that I had to forgive them, that this was eating me up inside. But I couldn't. I couldn't. I wasn't capable of it. And I would go to bed just sobbing, not to myself, but like sobbing out to God for help, that I needed help forgiving them, and just begging him to forgive me for not being able to forgive them. Because I knew that I should. I knew that I had to, but I couldn't. And one morning, I hadn't thought about confession since my first confession. It was one of the things I didn't agree with about the Catholic Church. I never went after my first confession. I didn't see why you couldn't just confess by yourself, because God knows your heart, right? But I woke up one morning, and just by the grace of God, I realized I have to go to confession. I couldn't have told you why I had to go to confession, because all of my reasons for not going to confession still seemed pretty good to me. But I recognized that I had to go. I couldn't do it by myself. I just couldn't do this by myself. And so I went to my friend, my housemate, who was also Catholic, and I said, I have to go to Mass today. And she said, oh yeah, okay, I'll come with you. And I said, I have to go early because I have to go to confession. And she looked at me and she said, oh, I think I should go too. And it turns out that she either had not gone since her first confession. So we both went to the church early together. Neither of us really remembered what to do. We had looked it up online earlier, but you're nervous, you don't remember. And I stood in line so nervous, I felt like I was going to throw up. And I almost turned away because I felt so sick. But I knew that I had to do this because God had told me to. I wouldn't have thought of it by myself. And so I went into the confessional and knelt down, and I couldn't remember the words. I was too nervous and just, I felt too sick. And I told Father, I haven't been to confession since I was a kid, and I don't remember what to do. And he said, okay, that's okay. We'll do this together. And he walked me through the whole thing. And I walked out of that confessional knowing that I had been forgiven. And that's not to say that I didn't continue to struggle with all of those same emotions that I had gone into confession for, and all of the things I had gone in for. But I always knew that I could go back and that God would meet me there in a very powerful way. Again, I couldn't reason out why. I still had all the reasons that I shouldn't have to go, but I knew that he had met me there. I knew he was calling me there, and I knew it worked. And it was through that that God taught me something very important. He taught me that I could be wrong. He taught me that maybe, just maybe, this church that had a memory that spanned back 2,000 years might know something that I didn't. And so I began to ask all of my questions again. I had stopped when I went to university because there was really no one I could ask. But I started asking again, and I started asking with a new attitude, asking the same questions, open to being wrong, open to being disproven. I didn't have a lot of people that I could talk to about it, and so I went to the same place that I went for all of the information for my homework. I went to the internet. And there were a lot of different resources that I came across, but I think the one that was most foundational for me was I went onto YouTube and I found Ascension Presents. And I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Ascension Presents, but at the time, it was only Father Mike Schmidt. There was no one else. Now it's a lot of other people. And Father Mike Schmidt helped to answer so many of my questions. He has this gift for really boiling things down to the base. And it was the base that I was struggling with. And once I had things boiled down to the base, once I could understand the base and how God had revealed this to us and why it actually was biblical, which often I couldn't see, then I could understand everyone else's arguments. Then I could understand everything else that kind of built up that idea and that tradition. And so with the help of Father Mike Schmidt on Ascension Presents on YouTube, and with the help of other blogs and resources online, then I was ready for books. Then I was ready to talk to other people. And I started realizing that the church had so much wealth and richness that I hadn't been open to, that I hadn't been able to understand before. It took a few years. God was very patient with me during those years. But not only did I begin to understand all of these teachings of the Catholic Church and why God lives so fully in them and helps us to live so fully in them, but I also began to go to Mass every week, and I began to go to confession regularly and really to meet God more deeply in the sacraments. And it was through that whole journey that I really came to the point where I wasn't just nominally Catholic, having had received the sacraments, but I was living as a Catholic and believing as a Catholic and existing and just being as a Catholic in this beautiful tradition that we have. And it was very interestingly through that whole journey that God had really been so creative during to get to me. He had used so many different things. He had used my Protestant church. He had used my Protestant children's Bible. He had used the Quran. He had used the Druze tradition. He had used my parents' move. He had used my Muslim friend. He had used my school and my church. He had used my mother's own journey. He had used my friends at school, my teachers, the internet, and even my parents' divorce he had used to really meet me in a deeper way, to help me to fulfill that first longing that I had when I first fell in love with him in the pages of my Protestant children's Bible, where I wanted to know him for who he was and not who I was projecting onto him or wanting him to be, for who he was. And in all of that creativity, when I first began discerning religious life and a religious vocation, he led me to the Daughters of St. Paul from the internet. I found them on the internet. And he led me to this order that had their spirituality based on two things: on the living Word of God, where I had first fallen in love with Jesus, and on the Eucharist, where I had first realized that he was present in this Catholic Church in a way he was not present anywhere else. And the mission of the Daughters of St. Paul is to spread the gospel and the love and mercy of Jesus Christ through all the means of communication, and that includes social media and the internet and books and face-to-face. And it was all of those things that God utilized to get to me, to draw me in further and deeper into him. He has a sense of humor. He knew exactly what he was prepping me for. But I was so grateful and so struck by that continuation of my journey. And so I know that it kind of sounds like I've told my life story, because in a sense I have. I think a lot of times when we hear the word conversion story, we think that there's going to be a Paul on the road to Damascus moment. And sometimes there is, but I think for a lot of us it's a long road. It's a continual, slow progression of conversion. And God doesn't give up on us during that time. He gave me easily 15 years from the first day that I stepped foot into a Catholic church to the time that I was really living and believing as a Catholic. And I think that just because of that, when we can see his patience and his creativity in my life, in your lives, we can trust that that same patience and that same creativity, he's working on you, on your continual conversion as we all turn our hearts more and more deeply to him, and in the lives of the people that you love. So if there's anyone in your life that you're watching and you can see, like, you wish that they understood more, you wish that they would come back to the church, you wish that they would have a conversion of heart, trust that the Lord loves and wishes for that even more than you do, and that he is working in patient and creative ways to get to them. And if you're in a position where you can see aspects of your life where you can see that your heart needs to be converted even more, and we all have those aspects, try to look for those ways that God is working in your life, because he is, and he's profoundly patient and profoundly creative. So thank you so much for having me and for listening to my story. And if you have any questions at this time, either about my story or the influences in my life, or my religious vocation or anything like that, I'll happily take them at this time. Yeah. Are my brothers and my parents still Catholic? That's a really good question. My brothers did get confirmed after me. I guess I sort of set a trend. My youngest brother is a practicing Catholic, and my mother is in RCIA this year. So please pray for her. She will be being received into the church this Easter. And yeah, my father's still a Protestant. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Oh, how did my family react to my decision to pursue a vocation? Various reactions from various people. My youngest brother was extremely supportive right away, and I'm so grateful for him. It was very difficult for the rest of my family for various reasons. I think especially for my parents, because you put in so many dreams into your child for their good. And I had a really wonderful life before that I kind of left behind. And I think that from their perspective, I was abandoning all of these good things that God had given me to pursue this life that was crazy and old-fashioned and required leaving my country and all of those things. And also for my family that's not Catholic, it's hard to understand that I'm not giving my life to an organization, I'm giving my life to a person that I love. And that's been a slow, I think, realization for them, but they're coming around, and at no point did they ask me to stop, and I always was so grateful for that freedom. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much for having me, and God bless you all.